Okay, thank you. I think I'm going to start now and let people join us over the next few minutes. So welcome to this third event in the Climate Mobilization Montgomery County Chapter Speaker Series. The series is intended to educate and inspire and engage us all around big and urgent climate action topics. So our intention is to build a broad-based group of stakeholders and individuals in the county who are ready to work together to develop unified input into the Montgomery County Draft Emergency Climate Action and Resilience Plan, which will be released in November for public consultation. For those of you who are new to our webinars, the Climate Mobilization is a national leader on the climate emergency and really getting leaders to speak the climate truth, which is that we are living in an existential crisis which is unfolding around us. The TCM chapter in Montgomery County was a catalyst for getting the Montgomery County Council to declare a climate emergency mobilization in December 2017. This includes the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2027, 100% by 2035, and also talks about initiating large-scale efforts to remove carbon from the atmosphere. This was the first county in the US to declare a climate emergency. Before we get started, I really want to thank everybody who's been working on this webinar speaker series. We're an all-volunteer group, so it takes a lot of work. And a particular shout out to Louise Mitchell and Natalie Wormers and Andy Miller, who are managing the Zoom meeting. As somebody said to me recently, there's this new term now, the Zoomologist, who we need in our lives, our new lives. So our agenda this meeting is that I will introduce the panel and then we will have each of our panel members make a short presentation, and then we will go into a panel discussion with a few questions. And we will be inviting participants, those of you on the line, to put your questions in the chat so that I can ask some of those questions of the panel as we move into the discussion. And then we will just wrap up with some comments on what might be next in terms of taking the question of why resilience matters forward. So just a few points on protocol. We are keeping participants muted and we prefer if people kept their videos off just to protect bandwidth. We're also a large group of people coming in here. I can see we've got 48 people on the line now. And bandwidth is an issue. We're also recording this webinar for sharing and posting on YouTube. Please do use the chat box at any time to submit your questions. And as I said before, if you're from outside the county, do introduce yourselves and say where you're from so that we can see who's connecting with us. So it's my pleasure to introduce the panel. I'm going to start just by introducing myself. My name is Dorcas Robinson. I am moderating the panel as a member of the TCM MoCo Steering Committee. I also served as a member of the Sequestration Work Group for the Montgomery County, developing the Montgomery County Climate Plan. My day job is that I work with organizations engaged in international development and humanitarian assistance. And these are organizations who are taking action on and advocating for investments in resilience for people and ecosystems in the global south. So you will hear that international perspective on resilience in my opening comments. I'm thrilled to introduce this wonderful panel. I'm going to start with Cassandra Breeze-Ceballos, who serves as the Multi-Solving Program Associate for Climate Interactive, a really interesting climate action organization. She's a proud first-generation college student who graduated in 2017 with a dual major in economics and sociology. Born and raised on the island of St. Croix in the US Virgin Islands, Cassandra is passionate about advocating for justice and equity within and across the environmental field. So really happy to have Cassandra with us today. We also have Kristen Baja, who goes by Baja, and she is the Urban Sustainability Directors Network's Program Director for Climate Resilience, and she's responsible for helping cities to identify strategic ways to advance climate resilience and to build that capacity to take proactive action on climate resilience. Baja spends a lot of her time on centering racial equity in all resilience work, and facilitating workshops and trainings that support working at the nexus of resilience, greenhouse gas mitigation, and racial equity in order to achieve more collaborative and transformational action. Prior to joining USDN, she served as the Climate and Resilience Planner with the City of Baltimore's Office of Sustainability, where she led the city's climate and equity work. And she holds a Master's of Urban Planning and a Master's of Science from the University of Michigan. And in 2016, Baja was recognized by the Obama administration as a champion of change for her work on climate and equity. And finally, I welcome Betsy Taylor, who's a longtime leader in the climate movement, and she has served as president of 350 Action, One Sky, Center for a New American Dream, and on the boards of numerous groups, including Ceres and Greenpeace. Since 2015, she's focused primarily on advancing the field of regenerative agriculture and nature-based solutions to the climate threat. So Betsy has a consulting firm in Tacoma Park, Maryland, Breakthrough Strategies and Solutions. And she's part of multiple local and global networks advancing climate solutions, as well as projects to promote democracy, equity, the empowerment of women, and sustainable consumption. And I wanted to note that Betsy also served as a member of the Montgomery County Sequestration work group as we were working on recommendations for the climate plan. So welcome to the panel. I'm going to start just by providing some framing comments around the concept of resilience for us tonight. Resilience is a word that we use intuitively. It sort of has meaning for us. We might have different layers of meaning behind it. It might be resilience in relation to health. It might be thinking about flooding or heating or other shocks that we think about in terms of resilience. We might think of properties of resilience like being robust or innovative or flexible. So in the last decade plus, as I will talk about, a lot of organizations have been trying to give more active substance to this word resilience. And that's what we're going to talk about a bit more tonight. Resilience is a word that's being used in the title of the Emergency Climate Action and Resilience Plan, the ECARP. I should note that Montgomery County, TCM MoCo is appending the term emergency to this. So we call this the ECARP because we are committed to keeping the focus on the emergency piece of this. So resilience is used in that title. You will also see the word resilience appear in different places in the Thrive Montgomery 2050 general plan, which is also being developed concurrently with the ECARP. So in this discussion tonight, we're going to talk about why resilience in action is so important to the Climate Action and Resilience Plan. We'll share some examples of how you put that resilience thinking into practice, and we'll conclude with some proposals around ensuring that resilience has more prominence in the ECARP when it comes out for discussion in November. So why does resilience matter and to who? I mean, one of the things I wanted to talk about from a global perspective is that for the past couple of decades, vulnerable communities around the world, indigenous communities and other people have been raising their voice around the fact that they are feeling the extreme impacts of climate change. It's affecting lives and livelihoods. At the global level in the climate negotiations, this action has supported the development of a focus on what is called adaptation, so funding to help least developed countries, small island states, to adapt to those impacts of climate change. You'll see this young person here from Tuvalu holding up a sign saying, you know, to the rest of the world, please could you prepare a place for my country to stay? Because another piece of this is what happens when beyond adaptation. There are parts of the world and communities around the world who are losing their historic homelands through sea level rise or loss of indigenous livelihoods, for example. And there is another part of the global climate discussion at the policy level around something called loss and damage. So how do we help communities to transition when they've got to a point of being beyond adaptation? lives in this part of the world, we've become much clearer in this past decade on some of the impacts of climate change that we're feeling. And I have a picture here from Ellicott City from 2018 with flash flooding. Also in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we see regional partners focusing on the need for a resilient food system, things that start to break down when things are under stress, and when beginning to appreciate that we need to think about how shocks and stresses affect us. So effectively, resilience matters for everybody, but probably in different ways in terms of the kind of focus and investment that we need to put into different communities. So what is resilience? There are a lot of different organizations and platforms out there that have tried to give practical meaning to this term by developing working definitions that work for them. I'm going to just headline the example here from 100 Resilient Cities, which was a network that was supported through the Rockefeller Foundation to promote urban resilience. And that definition talks about urban resilience being the capacity of individuals, institutions, systems within a city to survive, adapt, and grow no matter what chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience, which can be diverse and various, obviously, in an urban context. The other one I wanted to focus on here is a definition from the Stockholm Resilience Center, which is focusing on social ecological systems and basically saying, look, humans and nature are strongly coupled to the point where we should conceive of them as one social ecological system. We can't simply talk about resilience in a social context alone. There are virtually no ecosystems that are not shaped by people, and no people without the need for ecosystems. So I just wanted to foreground that definition for the discussion tonight and draw out a few points from these different understandings of resilience. One is that resilience is something that protects human well-being through shocks and uncertainty. That's what we're focused on. Resilience is something that we can strengthen through capacities to absorb, recover, adapt, and transform that makes it actionable. And resilience has to be thought about in terms of how we work with ecosystems and how we learn to live within our ecological boundaries. So as I have said, a number of organizations and platforms have been developing these concepts of actionable resilience. Here are a few examples. You can find the US Climate Resilience Toolkit online. These are efforts to turn working definition into practical tools that communities and cities can use. The Resilience Shift is an investment through Arup, the global engineering firm, and Lloyd's Registry, which is focused on getting big developers to think about resilience in infrastructure. I'm quite involved with the Global Resilience Partnership, which is a platform of partners around the world who are focusing on investments for vulnerable people and places, and actually is spearheading discussion globally around something called the Race to Resilience, which will be part of the run-up to the next Climate of the Parties, the next climate conference next year. So these are platforms and organizations that are turning their working definitions of resilience into practices and developing metrics to understand how they're making progress. And finally here, I just wanted to talk about, this is a nice picture from Rock Creek Park, my local walking spot. Just some principles for a resilience practice. I mean, resilience theory, whether it's in psychology or ecology or engineering, talks about characteristics like diversity or building in redundancy, to have some kind of buffer when in the face of uncertainty, or to be able to be flexible and adaptable when things don't quite go right or as expected. But you also see three other really important concepts in these understandings of resilience. One is that it's vital to place equity and justice at the core of our resilience work. Another one is that resilience needs to be about learning, about what people call taking small bets, trying things, and being prepared to fail fast and move on. And if something works, scale it up. And then another piece of this is, at its heart, resilience thinking is about working in systems. So it's about being able to think and act systemically, our ability to work collaboratively across silos of solutions, and think about how we are affecting other systems through the solutions that we are implementing or promoting. So those are some important principles for resilience practice. And I just wanted to flag for everybody that, I mean, the the working groups on the climate, the climate action plan for Montgomery County did an incredible job. There are 860 quite interesting recommendations that consultants are looking at now. You can find all of those online. The adaptation and sequestration group got split into two, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of points here. Both of the groups talked a lot about resilience. Just for example, the sequestration group put forward as its goal 3 this point about moving from silos to systems change, taking a sort of whole, taking a holistic approach to enabling innovation. And so we're focusing on increasing carbon sequestration, but through nature-based solutions, understanding ways to maximize co-benefits. So the infographic on the slide talks about some of those co-benefits. When we focus on drawing carbon into the soil through nature-based solutions, what we're doing is also helping to control erosion, help water retention in soils, improve agricultural yields, increase food security and other agricultural products that we need, and reducing greenhouse gas emission. So this ties in this idea of resilience as being about those co-benefits that we need. And the adaptation group, this is an example from their discussions. They're saying we need the county to put a climate change lens on our hazard mitigation, natural resource management, human health plans, and other responsibilities of the county. We need the county to focus on the most vulnerable people and groups. We need to be prepared for hotter summers and more intense rain and windstorms as the hazards that we are dealing with. And some of their proposals for around extreme temperatures include things like developing the urban canopy, dealing with heat island effects through green corridors in urban spaces, and talking about community-based resilience and how communities are working to strengthen their resilience. So I encourage people to take a look at some of these recommendations. Andy has posted in the chat a link to where you can find them online. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to invite Cassandra to talk to us about her work in multi-solving. Cassandra, welcome.
Hi, folks. So my name is Cassandra Briceballos, as Dorcas said, and I work as the Multi-Solving Program Associate for Climate Interactive. Multi-solving is actually a term/concept coined by Dr. Elizabeth Stallman, one of the co-directors and co-founders of Climate Interactive. And it describes interventions that improve lives, health, and equity while also protecting the climate. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Dorcas. Thank you. This image represents the complex system that we live in. It includes human species. Thank you. Sorry, guys, I'm not manning my slides. It's a little, nope. Can you go the other, back a couple? Well, this image represents the complex system we live in, and climate work tends to be very carbon-centric in its framing. We focus on units of carbon dioxide. You can go to the one that says the carbon-centric with multi-solving. I'll wait until the slides are. So if you can go back to the map that said, yep, and then you can go to the next one. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Sorry, Dorcas. Sorry. Go back to the map, that final slide before this one with the carbon-centric and multi-solving concentric circles. It's the one right before that.
Sorry, Cassandra, this is all I have.
Perfect. It's okay. I can just, you can just pause there. So climate work tends to have a very carbon-centric focus where units of measurement are in the amount of greenhouse gases reduced, and we measure progress based on that. Multi-solving broadens that approach to include all the things that could be better in a world where we make impact on climate change, such as resilience and equity. And now you can go to the next slide. Can you go to the next slide, Dorcas? Thank you. So take, for example, burning less coal. In Montgomery County last month, the Durkison generating station shut down 3 of their units at the coal-fired power plant. That one intervention creates solutions to multiple problems. In the long term, you're going to protect the climate by reducing greenhouse gases. But in the short term, you have many co-benefits. One is reducing outdoor air pollution, because for the communities that live around that coal-fired power plant, you also reduce indoor air pollution for individuals that rely on burning coal for their energy source. You reduce heavy metal toxins in food and water, and all of those things result in enormous economic savings because of health savings and reduced environmental degradation, as well as increased worker productivity. Next slide, please. So we developed at Climate Interactive, we developed a visual tool called FLOWER, which stands for the Framework for Long-Term Whole System Equity-Based Reflection, that assists in evaluating potential multi-solving policies. When engaging in discussion and planning about how to implement climate interventions, FLOWER tool helps assess the potential, not necessarily guarantee, but potential for multiple equitable benefits. While solutions that protect the climate have the potential to benefit everyone in a community, and even can be targeted at certain groups that have been disenfranchised and historically left out, such distribution does not happen by accident. It has to be planned for. Can you please go to the next slide? So I want to apply FLOWER to a real world example, such as the Montgomery County coal-fired power plants and Durkison generating station. While those coal-fired power plants were shut down and that created co-benefits, 63 people lost their job. Can you go to the next slide, please? So 63 people, no, back one. If 63 people lost their job, one forward, you can't highlight that blue jobs and assets petal for FLOWER. However, that action, that intervention could have been made more holistic if they had some type of a support in the form of job training or preferential hiring agreement for the individuals who lost their jobs when designing that climate intervention. So whenever we have a climate intervention, we must keep in mind any potential unintended consequences of an intervention. Next. So the Baltimore Orchard Project is a really great example of how you can hit all of those petals at once. Since its inception in 2012, the Baltimore Orchard Project has planted nearly 100 orchards with over 1,000 fruit and nut trees in different parts of Baltimore. They've harvested over 25,000 pounds of produce, most of which go to food pantries and mobile farmers markets. Can you go to the next slide, please? The Baltimore Orchard Project was specifically created with environmental justice in mind. The goals were to improve food security, build community ties, and increase the urban forestry canopy, which in turn reduces flooding runoff, as well as conserves energy due to reduced urban heat island effect. The collaborators were many. You had nonprofit sectors, private sectors, public sectors joining in on that. You can go to the next slide, please. The reason that this Baltimore Orchard Project was so successful is because they specifically targeted food deserts or healthy food opportunity areas where people don't have easy access to produce. So they worked with congregations, churches, mosques, and schools and different community-based groups to find out where those food deserts were and to specifically plant those orchards in those food deserts. Can you go to the next slide, please? To bring it back to FLOWER, this is an example of a project that hit on all of those petals. because it increased co-benefits in all of those buckets that flower touches on, as well as protected the climate and increased equity. And you can go to the last slide, please. So how do we support more multi-solving and create more opportunities for multi-solve? Well, first of all, include perspectives of the most impacted communities. So it's not enough to just ask who is at the table. You have to see and understand how power is being shared around that table, and if other people's perspectives are being included. Second of all, you have to have cross-sectoral working groups. So when you're convening people to plan some type of climate intervention, make sure that you're having people that touch on multiple different industries. Finally, measure, record, and share the multiple benefits that are being realized. This not only allows others to replicate the work by just learning from the documentation, but my favorite part about multi-solving is it inspires hope. Multi-solving is the answer to climate pessimism and climate doom, because we can make so many lives better in the short term, as well as protecting the world in the long term. And then next, please. Here are some, this coloring isn't great on this slide, but there's some multi-solving resources links that Dorcas will share in the follow-up email. And you can learn more about multi-solving in that way. And that's it.
Great, thank you, Cassandra. And I really appreciate multi-solving, having spent a lot of my life working directly in communities. I think it sounds like a great tool for kind of simplifying what is really complex and really hitting on those multiple priorities that are real in people's lives. Climate often isn't the first thing that feels real for many people. Thank you. So I'm going to invite Baja now to talk about her work. And Baja, I think you can share your screen. Thank you.
Can you see this all okay? Okay. We'll go unless I hear otherwise. So first of all, I would just like to acknowledge the land I'm standing on right now is from Native tribes who originally were settled here from the Nanticoke Indian tribe and the Piscataway tribe of Maryland. And that's really important as far as doing resilience and equity work, to acknowledge that the land that we're all standing on is not our land. It was land that was stolen. I additionally want to mention that I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm also a privileged woman based on my skin color. My white skin, my education, and my position provide me with privilege. That privilege, simply put, is its unearned advantages that have been afforded to me. And I want to make that clear before we get started, because I'm going to talk a lot about racial equity. So I work with a really amazing network called the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. I'm very privileged to work with this group. It's over 240 communities in North America. Montgomery County is actually one of those communities. We have over 1,500 active members that are really focused on peer learning, innovation, and collective action in greenhouse gas mitigation, climate resilience, and social equity, but not siloing those approaches from each other, working together on all of them at an intersectional space. One of the things I will say that's really important is obviously change is the new normal. We have become very comfortable and complacent. This idea of the Amazon Prime mentality. I would like everybody to try to think about how to get out of the idea that something should arrive at your doorstep the next day if you order it today, or that you should have watermelon all year round and available at your grocery store. We have a lot that needs to change in order for this work to get done effectively, and that starts with us as individuals, and then it starts with our collective groups as well. So this work is something that I really challenge folks to think individually about their positionality, about their power, about their privilege, and then what does that mean to bring others along with you. I also want to mention that this work is really hard. We aren't in a stable state. Obviously, we're sitting here dealing with a global pandemic in a midst of hurricanes, typhoons, wildfires, air quality deficit, earthquakes, all kinds of other things happening. And so we're not going to be in a stable state. And I think this idea of returning to quote unquote normal is something, again, that we kind of have to get out of. We're in an unstable time, and that's scary, and that change is scary. But that uncertainty and that change is what we have to embrace and actually in order to be effective here. So I talk a lot about broken systems, and actually there's an intentional question mark here because I want to talk about the US Constitution and the framing of why we have government in this country. Essentially, we started this country and we, I would say, colonized this country by treating people as property and free and low cost labor, only meant to maximize profits. There was land and water access stolen, and it's based on this belief that white men are superior and that women were second-class citizens and treated as property. In addition, Black people specifically were treated as property. And I want to get into one false narrative that happens a lot when I talk about this, is the idea that people came over to this country and pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. There's a difference between coming to this country to find opportunity because you have that opportunity available to you, or coming to this country being treated like a slave and put into slavery and held down for 400 years over and over and over. So there is a difference. The system itself is not broken. It was based on a lot of broken mentality, though, and ideas. And so our focus in USDN is being honest, about the founding of this country and the racist policies and practices that we have within government, but also the fact that we're a very reactive species and we've built reaction into what we do, especially when it comes to resilience. We have traditionally centered hazards over humans. We have focused on disruptions rather than the people who we're trying to impact. We've put infrastructure and the value of buildings and their contents over the value of people and their social connectivity. So we need to make a shift, and that shift needs to be from this reactive approach to a proactive approach. I know that the definition of resilience is complex, but I would also say that I think resilience, even if it has more than one definition, we need to get out of the idea of resilience being focused on the hazard and resilience being in a quote unquote bounce back. Resilience is something that we want to have the ability to anticipate, accommodate, but also positively adapt and thrive amidst our changing climate conditions. We need to be able to enhance quality of life now, today, in every sort of mode that we're in, and I'm going to get into that. So when I talk about resilience, I don't talk about resilience as this one definition. Resilience has actually got to be something that's holistic. It's year-round. It's what we're doing all the time. And so I talk about resilience modes. We talk about the fact that we're kind of in this disruption and recovery space a lot. We're having more and more disruptions and more recovery, but we forget to get out of that and think about what can we do when we're not in that space? How can we get into this preparedness element? And so just to say, we frame it in 3 resilience modes. We think about this every day, non-disruption space, and how can we actually focus on communities first? Then in the disruption, and both acknowledging there's short-term and long-term disruptions that we need to be thinking about, and then recovery. I also think what we're doing a lot with USDN is getting out of the cookie cutter approach, this one size fits all, treating everybody the same. We do it a lot in response and recovery. We use case studies as best practices to encourage people to do the same set of things based on very, very different circumstances. The reality of case studies and all these things is, again, they're cookie cutters and they're not actually helping us. What we need to do is take into account the uniqueness of our communities and the people who make up that community. We need to center our work on people and their unique cultural backgrounds and their needs, and not just treat them as extraction for information or approval on a plan, but instead get into how are we actually thinking about connecting them. Social isolation is one of the most dangerous elements of unfortunately, resilience, and it's where we are right now in this idea of disconnection, and we need to be thinking about bringing people together even in the midst of a pandemic. So what we're focusing on in USDN is, again, getting out of that one size fits all. We're focusing a lot on content, what happens in our plans, but also what's the process and how does the process change? How do we get out of this idea that we can do all the same things and all the same funding resources? And we think about different process pathways and different things that we can be doing as a group to improve our communities, to thinking about integrating and having these other sort of opportunities to bring in different power dynamics, different partners, and actually integrate this work with our communities. I'm going to skip forward real quick and just mention, and I know we'll get into some conversation, that this work is actually really scary. It's something about acknowledging privilege and power and letting go of power. And it was mentioned in the previous presentation, power is a massive component of resilience that we need to be able to acknowledge. Our own power, our own privilege, but also our ability to make that shift and make that change. Different approaches will lead to different results. And right now we're not acting fast enough. So it's really, really important for us to try new things instead of continuing to replicate the things that haven't been working in our communities. And I will move you back to stop share.
Thank you, Kristen. And it's, I really encourage people to look more at the US Sustainability Director's work. I was really inspired when I first came across it. And, you know, I think your comments tonight are really exactly where we need to be in the conversation right now. So thank you. I'm going to ask Betsy Taylor to talk to us next about why resilience matters. Betsy, thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you especially to Dorcas, who has put so much into this and was a real whirlwind of activity on the Montgomery County Sequestration and Adaptation group, and also to Cassandra and Baja and Louise and Andy. Really wonderful to be with you. And to the many people on this that are also terribly impressive. I know many of you, and this is quite a high-powered group on this call. So I slapped these slides together very quickly. I originally thought there were no slides, so these are informal. My comments will mainly focus on the importance of land as a key part of resilience. Our farmlands, our forests, our wetlands, our gardens, our parks. And when you look at what's happening in the world today, there's been a great change in the last 5 years with a great recognition that we need to restore our land. We're losing it so quickly. Soils, over 1/3 of the world's soils are severely degraded. Some scientific studies suggest we only have 60 years of healthy harvests left because of how much soil we've lost. I was just part of a conference some of you may have been part of called The Great Unraveling. It was a global conference put together by the V. Con Rasmussen Foundation and the Post-Carbon Institute. And it was really looking at all the systems, as Cassandra was pointing to, all the systems that are in distress: biodiversity, water, land, air, oceans, and humans. I mean, the gap, as Baja pointed out, the massive gaps between those that have and those that don't. So in that, you know, one of the things we were looking at was how climate impacts are, just as an example, climate impacts are affecting, are causing these spiraling effects. So you've got tremendous desertification and warming causing loss of water, loss of healthy soil, loss of food production, and mass migration, which then is pushing, you know, I think I can't remember the exact number, but millions on the move right now. I believe it's close to 80 million people on the move globally due to displacement, violence, and the inability to have a survival kind of mode at home. And that's leading to the rise of autocratic governments. So there's this sort of systemic thing going on with the impacts we're facing and the need to be resilient. When you look at restoring land in many different ways, locally or globally, you can see here some of the co-benefits. It's another way perhaps of talking about things. We can sequester carbon in soil if we restore that soil and treat it the way we know we can. We can get great food security, which I think many people have really focused on food security since the pandemic started, and it's created openings for transforming our food systems. When you restore soil and put organic matter into soil, you also allow for tremendous resilience in terms of floods or droughts. When I was on the Montgomery County Sequestration Adaptation group, one of the things that I was struck by was talking to a local member of the group who's with the water management system, WSSC, who just said, you know, everybody thinks we're going to just be all precipitation here, but we're also going to have droughts. We don't know if the Potomac River can actually support the number of people that are projected to be here. So when we restore our soils, we're actually holding water in the land. We're holding water in our watersheds, and helping farmers. And you'll see in my comments also, as the slide by Baja pointed to, hold on, wait an hour, my computer wants to restart. When you had that slide she showed with everything coming out of her mind, how crazy everything is. When we think about resilience in the land, it's also our place in it with other living things and the need for us to be out in it and off of Zoom sessions. So I just wanted to say in large context here that, and I've got to move on because I'm running out of time, but that things have changed dramatically in the last 5 years, and there is a great global focus now on restoring soils, on regenerative farming, and on ecological restoration. So yeah, on this slide, I just want to briefly mention some of what's happened in those 5 years. Globally, there's been many scientific gatherings. The FAO put together a gathering of 500 scientists, and there was a definitive report that came out from the National Academy of Sciences, from the IPCC on the Climate and Land Report, all pointing to the great need for us to restore soils and to restore land, both to mitigate climate, but also to make us more resilient and to boost food production, help us to be secure in our communities. So now there is a real push for this to incorporate it into the next COP, to incorporate it more effectively within the SDGs. And nationally, likewise, every Democratic candidate for the presidency incorporated land restoration, ecological restoration, and regenerative farming into their platforms. And Vice President Biden has it as a strong part of his platform. Many states are moving on it. There have been both openings due to the pandemic and, of course, great challenges. There are pieces of legislation moving, which I'd be happy to speak to in the Q&A, some good, some not good. And as you can imagine, when you think about whole systems, some of those pieces of legislation assume an agricultural system that's very much industrial, global, commodity driven, and carbon market based. Some are much more focused on transformation, creation of closed loop economies locally, rooting our supply chains more locally. So I'm happy to talk about that. And in Maryland, there's a lot happening. There's a 1 million acre challenge to try to move towards restoring land and regenerative agriculture, but there's a long way to go. Next slide. So in Montgomery County, I wanted to get a little specific. There were so many fantastic people on the Montgomery County Sequestration and Adaptation group, and the reports, which are in the chat box, I really strongly recommend that you read them. I think Montgomery County can be a beacon for the world. We can compete and do as well or more than California, which is often at the helm. And sorry, canceling my time, and I will wrap up quickly, but you can see here we do need to press our appointed officials, our elected officials. There is a great push to develop due to population pressures. And we have to preserve our tree canopy. We have to preserve our agricultural reserve. We need a huge all hands on deck to do tree planting, gardening, park restoration. And all of this can help us be more secure, but can also generate jobs and generate economic opportunities for those who are the most hard pressed right now. And finally, and this is my third, I have one more slide, but this is a picture of my husband and son. I do think right now, in particular, just to even slow the rate of how we speak, how we breathe, and to get outside, because there's wisdom there that we need to tap, that's beyond the reports, that's beyond the data. And I think we all know this. Next slide. So there are many excellent resources on this. And again, when we think about land, we need to think about equity. Who has access to land? Whose land are we standing on, as Baja pointed out at the beginning of her comments? How do we look at land as a resource that can support not just human life, but all life? You know, there are so many small interventions. Cassandra pointed to a few. There are so many things that can damage our systems and can help our systems. Just how we manage mosquitoes is one. We can just knock out all the pollinators and knock out all the food for birds just by the way we spray, or we can support all of those systems. So it's taking a whole systems approach. I will stop there because I'm out of time, but I'm happy to take questions about the specific recommendations that came out of the Montgomery County Sequestration and Adaptation report. And just to say that part of resilience also finally is having each other. I think things are changing so fast. We all feel anxiety. Really taking time to find ways to connect, to stay in touch, to affirm other people, and to let them know, you know, together we can get through this so much better than alone. So I'm glad to be with you tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Betsy, and you really appreciate that thought. It's important to put that out there for all of us for different reasons at this time. So I'm going to invite all of you to put questions in the chat if there are things you'd like to ask all of the panel or individual speakers. And I'm just going to start by inviting Betsy and Cassandra and Baja to maybe highlight 2 or 3 key things that you have learned through your work that are useful for our communities and our cities moving forward. What would be your headlines and key lessons learned, just for inspiring people today? What excites you? What are you learning?
Sure. Is it okay if I start?
Go ahead, Cassandra, thanks.
So a couple of lessons I have is, first is be welcoming. Everyone matters and everyone is needed. We do not have enough time to tackle this global existential crisis without bringing everybody into the fold. Lesson number 1, everybody has a place in it. Learning and connecting. Solution starts all growth results from learning and connecting. We can succeed by addressing tough problems in an integrated fashion. We need to be connecting with each other and sharing what we're learning in order to really make a difference. And last is documenting and storytelling. Research shows that showing research doesn't work, but stories do. Telling stories about hope and possibility and using real-world examples of when people have done something against the grain and gotten amazing results makes a difference.
Thank you, Cassandra. That's great. I've been thinking a lot about my grandparents recently coming through the Second World War, and a very similar idea was the stories that we were told about that crisis and that process.
It's truly, the power of storytelling cannot be overstated. It's just very, very powerful. So I just encourage people to tell the stories of your co-benefits and your multi-solving.
Thank you. Baja, do you want to add something to that?
Sure. I think some of the things that I have learned recently or over the last sort of decade of doing this work is we need to get beyond the development of plans and toolkits. The work is not moving fast enough, and we create plans and then create new plans, and we have lots and lots of plans and lots of workshops to discuss making the plans. But the implementation is a massive component that's missing, and unfortunately right now a lot of the implementation is done really in a response space. And so how do we get beyond the plans and also really start to think about people as partners in the entire process? So changing the process from an extractive sort of space into an actually shifting of power. Another concept I'll introduce to everybody to take a look at later is the Haas Institute in Berkeley has coined a term called the targeted universalism approach. It's something that we're using a lot now with our USDN communities, which is essentially saying, yes, all people matter and all needs matter, but we have created disenfranchised communities through decades of racist policies and practices. We need to be thinking about corrective action as part of the work, and how are we prioritizing our funding, our capacity, and our time in the communities that we have intentionally held down for decades. So I think those would be two things I think are really important to embrace moving forward.
Thank you. And Betsy, do you have thoughts on that? 2 or 3 key things?
It's a great question. I think we do have to go fast, but we also have to try to, and I think we have, I agree with what both of the previous speakers have said. We have to get rid of our normal procedures, bureaucracies, processes, but we also need to keep returning to the well for wisdom. It tends not to come through analysis, I think, so much. I think it comes through times of quiet and solitude and time in nature. I do think that one of the things that the people on this group should consider is really weighing in with Montgomery County. It's very difficult at this point because of the captured states globally. I mean, so many nation states are not functional right now because of special interests that have corrupted them, fossil fuel interests, chemical interests. Very, very difficult to get transformation. We have to make sure that Donald Trump is not reelected. I'll just say that. But I also feel that if we can, in fact, create the stories that Cassandra was talking about locally, the examples of a sustainable economy, a circular economy, food systems that are local, financial systems that are local, not entirely, but I do think Montgomery County has the natural resources, the human resources, the ag reserve, which is so unusual. We have something very special. So I guess one of my reflections would be, let's seize that. Let's seize this place and each other and try to do everything we can. And just, you know, just by capturing food waste, just that one thing. I mean, I know this sounds very boring probably, but when you capture food waste and keep it out of the landfills and reduce the methane and then apply it to soil and create composting facilities that create jobs for disadvantaged, you know, San Francisco is the model on this. We can do that here and we should do it. And it's a whole system approach to restoring our land. So those are just a few thoughts.
Thanks, Betsy. And I think, you know, for many of us, this process of appreciating what we can do individually and with neighbors and in our communities is also an important piece of this, right? The process of individual action. But I wanted to address a question that's come up from the chat, which is, do we have examples of how funders and investors and businesses are pivoting to support resilience in different ways? I mean, I was just thinking of but one example, the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance that I referred to in my presentation sort of started its work from the realization that about 87% of funding for development in flood-prone communities and was dedicated to providing aid as response and recovery. And only 13% was really dedicated to looking holistically at how to increase resilience up front. And so that, you know, got an insurance company thinking hard about how it changes its funding approach around that particular challenge of flood. But you may have examples from other places, other types of business or investment that you'd like to speak to. I'm happy if anybody.
I can say something. I helped found the environmental grant makers and helped with the launch of the funders for regenerative ag and the Regenerative Ag Foundation. And more recently, myself have pivoted more to resilience and adaptation just really recently. And there are foundations moving more into that. And I would say that the groups on this call, I've actually, I don't think you guys know this, but I've funded all, you know, the donors I advise have funded Climate Mobilization, Climate Interactive, and Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And I would say that urban, all of them are looking at this. All of them are worthy of support. All of them are so important. And the Urban Sustainability Directors Network in particular has really looked at this and has tapped into some new sources. Clearly the Rockefeller Foundation is one, Rockefeller Brothers is another. So there is movement. I think, you know, there's still that part of people that feels, oh gosh, if we go to resilience and collapse and unraveling, it means we're giving up on mitigation. And I think we have to hold on to what Cassandra said, that no, it doesn't mean that. It actually just means we're facing reality. We know we're going to lose a lot. We're going to have a lot of hits. And by focusing on resilience that also has all these other co-benefits and is multi-solving, we're doing the best we can.
Thank you. Baja, I wonder if you have anything to say around this idea of pivoting investment. I'm wondering also particularly from the perspective that you've been talking about in terms of racial and social justice.
Yeah, so I mentioned there are multiple sources of funding. I think certainly, as Betsy mentioned, when you're looking at foundations and sort of these bigger foundations, we are seeing a shift in funding for paying people to be part of processes, paying for other things to go out and actually engage with communities, to have people be part of the process. That doesn't happen with sort of federal government funding for projects related to resilience. And I know 100RC is sometimes used as this model. I actually personally feel 100RC came into government and utilized a top-down approach that didn't really look at shifting power to communities and actually helping communities to determine for themselves. There was very much a structure that was attached to a politician. So there's pros and cons, right? We've tested it in a lot of ways, and I think it was a test that needed to happen, but I think that we're seeing shifts with Kresge Foundation, BAR, Summit, lots of others now that are looking at this sort of bringing local together, local community-based organizations, local groups, local partners, and looking at funding multiple partners together. And actually in this region, I think Town Creek Foundation, before they sunset, was one of the best models for how to do that, where they brought together a lot of partners to say, this isn't something we're just going to fund this one group or this one group. We're going to bring you together to try to collaborate on these bigger projects. So I think Town Creek really led the way in this space, and we're seeing other foundations start to replicate that. Unfortunately, at the federal level right now, I don't have a lot of really good things to say until hopefully after November.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we've also got some questions for people related to what are some resources that are useful for communities and even to individuals and families as we think about strengthening resilience to climate change? Are there things that you would point people to that they could work with, say, at a neighborhood level or a small city level? I'm thinking about some of our suburban, small urban contexts.
I mean, I do think we shouldn't underestimate the climate action plan from Montgomery County. I'm sounding like a one-track promoter here, but it was actually just what Baja just described. It was an effort by the county to bring together a very diverse group of people from across the county, bringing in as volunteers their wisdom, their expertise, and there's a tremendous amount here. So that is not, you know, that's not something you would use for working with kids, or it's not an easy guide. It's thick, but it's packed with fantastic recommendations and very specific suggestions. Someone in the chat box, this is on a different level, but mentioned Joanna Macy's programs and videos and speeches, and I concur that she's very helpful for anyone who's feeling kind of just overwhelmed or fearful or unable to look at some of the realities that we're all facing. It's a helpful program, but I think we should follow up. There are several, and I think we could probably follow up, Dorcas, with links for shorter publications and how to work at a city level, county level, even in your own home, your lifestyle choices.
That's right. Thanks, Betsy, for that. Baja or Cassandra, if you want to respond on that. Yep.
Yeah, I put a link in the chat, and I know it was something that you reached out to me around, Dorcas, originally, which is what are the opportunities to take action? One of the things that we've really been working with a lot of communities around is the utilization of neighborhood centers or neighborhood spaces that are trusted by members of the community already, that are retrofitted to meet all three modes of resilience. So the sort of everyday services, programming needs, communication needs, needs for health and sort of proactive healthcare, in addition to the elements that we can do to enhance and improve the area around for food generation, water capture, reuse. So I've been working on resilience hubs since I was in Baltimore City, and now it's something I'm working with several communities on, There's one that we're working on in Ward 7 in BC and several others in the region, but it's an opportunity to utilize or work at the intersection of greenhouse gas mitigation, climate resilience, social equity, to do that power shifting to members of the community to work in disenfranchised communities. So I think that it's a great opportunity to also consider an actual project or a center core place in a neighborhood that can be used for all of these other things that Betsy and Cassandra have been talking about, bringing that systems approach together, thinking about circular economy, thinking about job training and opportunities. So I put that link in there. There's obviously, as Betsy said, a lot more.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And yeah, people should take a look at the Resilience Hub material. Cassandra, did you want to add anything on this?
Not to that particularly, but maybe if we could move on to one of the other questions that were
Well, I mean, the other thing I wanted to ask you all was, what recommendations do you have about promoting resilience for local jurisdictions at the county, municipal level, moving forward? Are there key things that you think that local jurisdictions should be thinking about? If you'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, so I can jump in. So I want to start with a quote from our Climate Interactive co-director and co-founder, Dr. Elizabeth Salwin, and it goes, "Those who live most acutely with the impacts of multiple problems often have the most creative ideas about addressing them." So I'll say, those who live most acutely with the impacts of multiple problems often have the most creative ideas on how to address them. So we have acknowledged throughout this webinar that time and money are in short supply. There is not enough of either to treat climate change, inequity, and currently COVID-19 as separate issues. They must be treated in an integrated fashion. So my recommendation would be to convene integrated emergency task forces that bring together people from the private sector, the public sector, as well as community-based groups. And within those three buckets, bring people that have expertise in public health, climate, water, equity, human-based economics, and most importantly for myself, the life experiences of the people that are most impacted by these challenges. You have to have them not just at the table, but sharing power amongst them.
Thanks, Cassandra. And I think that actually there's another question in the chat box here. Is there a centralized source of information for taking action that offers a range of ways to get involved, which I assume is a question about, is there something at the county level which maybe gets at what you've just been talking about, Cassandra, this bringing together of task force from different sectors and perspectives?
Well, I've research, I've seen different ways, such as this Baltimore example of people coming together on different levels and working together to really enact impactful and positive change. And it has to, you have to really have that buy-in by those community groups. For too long now, most impacted communities have been talked at and had interventions applied to them and not been involved in the design and planning process. So from the very beginning, you have to have those voices and perspective at the table and not just have them there, but really give weight to what they're saying and understand that they know better than anyone else what could be done. So as a story, there was a woman in Atlanta, an elder woman living in this neighborhood where there was a sewage drain that kept overflowing, constantly overflowed. And, you know, there had been people that came in to do all kinds of community building and restorative projects. And all she wanted was to have that sewer drain addressed because that was creating pollution and problems for their community. So you have these different groups coming in thinking that they know what's best for them, but never taking the time to actually talk to those elders and understand what they need. So listen to the elders, listen to community elders. They have so much wisdom.
Thank you, Cassandra. That's a great, I mean, that is a central point. And I wonder if Betsy and Baja, if you wanted to add anything on what you would suggest or recommend for local jurisdictions as they think about resilience, particularly in the way we've been talking about it. Like what kind of recommendations would you make?
Well, I'll jump in a little bit, maybe out on the edge here, because it's not an area I know enough about. I like Cassandra's idea very much. I do think we need to find ways, even though we have to stay socially distanced, to bring diverse leaders together so that there's a collective ownership of really what we're in the middle of. And I do think Mark Elrich has done a good job on our task force, but now how does everyone own this and feel a deep connection to one another? So that's key. I also think Sylvia in the chat box talks about how do we have more co-ops, and it's related to what I'll say. I do think local jurisdictions, this is a tricky one, but I think so what's driving all the collapse? You know, what's actually driving it? On my mind, it's overwhelmingly an economy that is structured for constant consumption, growth, and expansion. And we've known this for decades, the limits to growth. And we're all tied into a global financial system that is destructive. And our pensions depend on it. Our savings, our security depends on that system thriving. And yet that system, with rising population and destructive technologies together, is what's bringing us down. And so I think local jurisdictions need to really get creative about locally owned credit unions, locally owned banks, green banks, putting some of the public procurement money, some of the public investment money into these alternative financial models, which can be alternative places for people to put their money in ways that really help build local economy. And I know there have been other sessions around some of these topics, but if you really want to get to the root of this and begin scaling, you've got to look at how money moves and what is it doing. And right now, we're all tied into a rather destructive sort of super global organism, which is this global economy. So I'd say, I mean, it's something that some places are trying. Montgomery County has a green bank, but it's not gotten anywhere near where it needs to. How do we incentivize co-ops? How do we incentivize the ability to have credit unions with revolving loan funds that support and finance regenerative farming, compost facilities, wetland restoration with job creation, all of that? How do we put our money in a place where we can feel excited about what our dollars are doing? So I feel like this is one of the cutting edge places that every local jurisdiction needs to be looking at.
Thanks, Betsy. And certainly in some of our upcoming webinars, we'll be talking about the consumption challenges, but also the supply challenges that we face, and getting a bit creative with thinking about that. Yeah, Herb is reminding us our next webinar will address what a post-growth wellbeing economy looks like, September 29th, 7:30 p.m. Yeah, Baja, would you like to speak to this?
Yeah, I do agree. I think that also, I'm going to be very honest that I come from a local government perspective in answering this question, because I do think change happens at the local level. There's a key element about demanding change from local politicians, and not just saying, oh, we want a certain code. This is about the way that dollars are spent. I don't know if any of you are aware of traditional cost benefit analyses, but they're incredibly archaic, and they're what we still use to determine how your capital improvement dollars are used and your operation and management dollars are used. They don't take into account social and environmental benefits. They don't take into account all these other cascading benefits over time. They also don't take into account the history. And so we continue to put money into high income areas where we have the loudest voices, rather than thinking about where dollars are spent and what's going to have the most benefit over time. So I think demanding that change with the way that funding is done and spent and assessed is really important, which gets into my second thing, which is around communications. When I worked in, and I've worked in 2 local governments, we get thousands of people making requests on a daily basis. often most of the NGOs or community-based organizations or community partners are demanding different things. And a real amazing way to actually make a difference is to collectively bring everybody together around one or two key messages and say them over and over and over and over and over, agreeing on the fact that those messages are going to have benefits for everybody over time. But if we're coming at it from, we need trees, we need this around water, we need this around ag, we need all these different things, it's too many and it doesn't work, and local governments get overdone. So I think the communications piece is really important. And then I want to touch on what Betsy said, which is understanding how you act and interact in the current structures and institutions. Each of us has our own individual work to do, and I mentioned it in the beginning because it's really, really uncomfortable. But how do we get out of the economy that she mentioned, the growth and expansion and division economy? You know, can you do one thing? Can you stop purchasing from Amazon? Can you stop purchasing from certain places that are not local? Can you make a commitment and then bring others along with you? There are simple actions that you can do to vote with your dollars, and we don't take them because it's not as easy or as convenient. So those are kind of things I would add on.
Yes, thank you. You have to reach that bit further to try and do something a bit different. And that's an important message, I think, for everybody. And I also want to just acknowledge that Cassandra was posting as well in the chat about co-benefits as well as costs. We need ways of taking decisions that value co-benefits, which may not have metrics associated with them that we can compare with other metrics, and that can make things challenging. And we talked a lot about that in the sequestration work group, developing our recommendations. I'd like to thank you all for your time. I'm going to wrap up now, but I want to ask each of you just maybe to share one thing that excites you about what you do. I sense there is optimism there, and maybe you could just share one final thought about what gives you energy every day. Who'd like to go first?
I'm sorry, my audio cut out. Can you just repeat the question for me, please?
I just would like to say thank you to all of you for what you've shared. It's been really fascinating, but to invite you to share one thing that excites you about what you do and gets you moving every day. Like, I'll tell you, for me, I've composted the whole of my life, and I now have 10 families composting with me. Going out to look at my compost makes me feel amazing every day, and I never thought I would have said that about myself. Yeah.
Sure, I'll start. So I'm from the U.S. Virgin Islands, St. Croix, and there's a big tradition of oral storytelling and passing down histories through storytelling and orating in a slower pace of life, and serving in the position of multi-solving associate. I get to tell these stories. It's such a big challenge, again, that we face. It's very daunting and seemingly impossible. Another quote by one of our other co-director, Drew, is, "Stopping climate change is hopeless. Let's do it." And we're going to do it by sharing stories and these little tiny bright spots that end up creating this giant solar system of possibility and hope. So that's my favorite part, is getting to tell stories, truly getting to do research and spreading hope and positivity.
That's a great one. I'm happy to go next if you want, Betsy.
Go for it. Yeah.
I would say for me, the thing that brings me hope right now is seeing all the young people who are way more aware and more passionate and more active in this space than I've seen in my entire life. And so that is inspiring, amazing. I love that my nephew is shaming, my sister for not recycling. So there's a lot of great things that are happening, I think, with young people today, and that's what brings me hope.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I would just, I guess, add on the compost side, I'm a master composter, and I too get enormous joy from my 5 community gardens. We harvested about 80 pounds of sweet potatoes today, and just being in the land, on the land, watching acutely what's happening is a source of great happiness. But on a hope basis, I'm part of several global sort of informal networks, and I am seeing in Finland, in Kenya, in Mali, in South Africa, in New Zealand, here in the United States, a lot of people getting involved in a celebratory way in restoring biodiversity and land. In Spain, they gathered people, families, and this was pre-COVID, but families, kids, musicians, artists, and had a whole 3-day gathering, which was about restoring, planting trees, creating community gardens, but having music involved. And I'm seeing people just doing that, sort of defying the darkness and saying, we're going to create these greenways, we're going to create these corridors. And there's something really powerful about that. So I find, and it's all ages, all types of people. It's happening on the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, which is one of the hardest places. But yet there's this standing up with indigenous groups there. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the tribe down there, but there's an indigenous group working with the Cajuns and you know, climate activists trying to restore along the coast. So I find that very, very positive on all levels. There's no regrets in it. So I guess that's what the story I'd share.
Thanks, Betsy. Yeah, the resilience of.
And I just wanted to add, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Cassandra.
Well, I wanted to add one more point / kind of a plug. So Climate Interactive, we've been tracking since COVID-19 stimulus and recovery packages started coming out around the world. We've been linking and tracking how those monies that are being spent relate to climate protection interventions, as well as actions that will increase equity. So we have created a database called GREAT, is the acronym, Green, Resilient, and Equitable Actions for Transformation. And I'll drop a link into the chat. That tracks how those monies are being spent to help COVID-19 recovery, but can also impact and combat climate change as well as increase equity. So I think of that, you know, in terms of trying to tackle many problems at once. And it's by no means an exhaustive database, and I'm you know, putting some work in, just me managing it, but I encourage y'all to check it out because there's another reason for hope within that.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. And I've seen several messages in the chat from people saying they're finding this really inspirational, and that's definitely something we're looking for, to inspire hope and possibility and engagement moving forward. So I really, really thank you, Betsy, Cassandra, and Baja, for your time and your energy and your insight and your experience being with us today. So just to wrap up for this evening, you know, resilience in the ECARP, what next? You know, some ideas here. I started off at the beginning saying, let's move from resilience as a word into what this means in action as we look forward. So for example, can we make social and ecological resilience an organizing concept in the ECARP? That would mean having a vision around that, a working definition and some guiding principles for what that looks like. Can we apply that working definition and principles as a lens and a guide on decision making? Can we kind of get into that stuff around co-benefits and trade-offs and for who benefits from what, more explicit, and help that to guide us with some of the decisions that politicians and technical people and businesses and other stakeholders will need to make moving forward? And yeah, can we use this to advance resilience practice across county departments, programs, and with other stakeholders in the business sector, professional associations, and other communities? Can we be proactive in identifying and unlocking opportunities for system solutions? Because we think about the challenges we face through a social and ecological resilience lens. So those are some thoughts on what we might like to see of resilience in the ECARP. And just in terms of what you could do next, many of you have joined us today. I mean, one One idea is that if you would be interested in taking part in some resilience-focused discussions as we prepare for making inputs into the draft ECARP, and also Thrive Montgomery, which, as I said, is running on a similar process, I would be very happy to convene some discussions and get some people working together on that. So you can email our email address, which is montgomerycountytcm@gmail.com, and we'll pick that up. You can also email that address if there are other things that you want to work on. If you would like to be a partner as we're building out more stakeholder and group discussion around these webinars. So thank you all for your time and attention this evening. It's been, as I said, inspirational and insightful and nourishing, which I think is also important in this day that we live in. So thank you again for your time. And this particular visual grabbed me, no nature, no future. It's sort of obvious, but it's sometimes easy to forget that in the day-to-day of how we live our lives. Yeah, thanks very much, and we'll see you next time. Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorcas, for such a wonderful event. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.